It's interesting, isn't it? Like, you know how something can feel totally normal to us, something we do every day, but then you realize someone from a different background might be like, whoa, wait, what?
Yeah, totally. I definitely had those moments traveling or even just talking to friends from different places. What you grow up with just seems, well, normal until you step outside that.
Exactly. And that difference in what we consider normal is a big part of what we're going to explore in this deep dive.
Right.
We've got these two really different sources today that, at first glance, don't seem related at all.
Uh-huh.
First, we'll listen to Raj and Amit. They're having this really engaging discussion about Indian culture.
Okay, interesting.
They get into some deep stuff about morality and what's seen as vulgar.
I see. So kind of unpacking different cultural values there.
Exactly. But then we're going to switch gears completely.
Okay.
We'll hear snippets from an English-speaking class, just people introducing themselves.
Interesting. So how do those two things connect?
That's what we're going to find out. Our mission today is to see how cultural values are talked about openly and debated in one context,
Okay.
but then maybe subtly revealed, without anyone even meaning to, in another context, like through someone's background or what they choose to share about themselves.
So we're going to be looking at both the big picture discussions and the smaller, everyday ways that culture shows up.
You got it.
Ah,
Okay, so let's dive in.
sounds good.
First up, Raj and Amit's conversation. It was fascinating to me how they brought up this tension within Indian culture.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more.
So, Indian culture has a really strong foundation in traditional values, right? Like
Yeah.
respect, family, discipline.
I see. Kind of like a moral base.
Yeah, exactly. But then alongside those values, there's also this historical openness towards sensuality.
Well, that's interesting. You wouldn't necessarily expect those two things to go together.
I know, right? It's not so black and white. And Amit really drives that point home when he starts talking about ancient Indian texts, sculptures, even literature.
So there's a history of being open about things that maybe today would be considered more taboo.
Totally. And the example Raj brought up, the Kama Sutra, that was perfect. I mean, here's a text all about desire and pleasure. It came from the very same cultural roots that might now say, object to even a kiss on screen.
Ah, okay. So you have this fascinating contrast. It really challenges any simple assumptions about conservative versus liberal cultures, right?
Right. And Emmett tries to explain this shift. He points to the influence of Victorian morality during British colonial rule. It's like, well, imagine a more open culture suddenly having this layer of Victorian-era ideas kind of imposed on it.
Oh, I see. So external forces can have a huge impact on cultural norms.
Exactly. And even today, years later, you still see this push and pull between wanting to preserve those traditional Indian values, but also embrace a more modern, maybe even Western idea of freedom of expression.
That makes a lot of sense.
And that actually leads right into Raj's big question. Where do you draw the line between freedom of expression and just being vulgar?
Yeah, that's a huge question in any culture. What one person finds totally fine, another might find offensive.
So true, and that's exactly what Amit gets at. He says vulgarity is subjective. It's not some universal standard.
Okay, I like that. So how does he illustrate that idea?
Well, he uses the example of nudity. Like, think about how some tribal communities in India might have traditions where partial nudity is completely normal, even celebrated.
Right.
But then you go to a big city, and that same level of nudity could be seen as totally inappropriate.
Wow, that's such a clear example of how context and cultural background shape what we consider acceptable or not.
For sure. But then Raj brings up another concern. He starts talking about media, particularly song lyrics and movie dialogues, and how some of it seems deliberately provocative.
I see. So he's wondering if that's pushing the boundaries of freedom of expression too far. Like, is it just about getting attention or pushing buttons?
Exactly. And it makes you think, are we just getting desensitized to stuff that would have shocked people a generation or two ago?
That's a real concern. But what does Amit have to say about that?
Well, he acknowledges that some of the stuff out there might feel gratuitous, but he says we have to remember that people have a choice. They don't have to consume everything they see or hear. If a song is too much for you, change the station.
Okay, so it's about individual agency, being able to choose what you expose yourself to.
Exactly. But then Raj brings up another important point. He worries about young people. Like, what about kids who are growing up constantly exposed to this stuff? Is there a risk that certain behaviors or attitudes become normalized, even if they're not healthy?
That's a valid concern. How does Amit respond to that?
It's interesting. Instead of saying, oh, we need to censor everything, Amit emphasizes the role of families in society. He talks about guiding kids, teaching them how to think critically about what they're seeing, and making their own judgments.
Ah, so equipping them with the skills to navigate a complex world, rather than just trying to shield them from everything.
Exactly. And this leads into Amit's final point, which I think is so insightful.
Hmm.
He talks about cultural evolution as a balancing act. It's not about just copying Western trends, but it's also not about clinging to outdated rules just because they're tradition.
I see. It's about finding a way to respect the past while also being open to progress.
And Raj totally agrees. He even says that culture and morality, they're not static things, they're constantly changing. The key is to be aware of those changes and understand them, not just try to shut them down.
So it's about understanding, not censorship.
Right. Which brings us to the end of their conversation. It was really fascinating to me how they explored that tension within Indian culture.
Mhm.
This blend of historical openness with more recent restrictions, and this constant process of figuring out where the lines are.
It definitely highlights that cultural values are complex.
Yeah.
And like you said, they're not fixed.
For sure. Okay, so now let's switch gears completely. Ready for something totally different.
Hit me with it.
All right, so now we're going into this English speaking class. It's just a regular class with people from all over trying to improve their English.
Got it.
But what's interesting is their introductions, like just the things they choose to share about themselves. It gives us these little glimpses into their backgrounds and maybe even their cultural values.
Oh, I see. So we're not talking about an explicit debate about culture anymore. We're looking for those subtle hints, those things that come out naturally when people talk about themselves.
Exactly. It's like when you first meet someone, what do you choose to tell them? That says something about what you think is important.
True, true.
Okay, so first up, we have Rahul from Mumbai. He says he's got a background in finance, he likes analytical problems, and he's been reading that book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Plus, he moved to London to get his MBA.
Okay, so right away, you get the sense that he's ambitious, driven, and the finance background, maybe that speaks to certain cultural priorities, like valuing careers in fields like business or technology.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. And then the self-help book, that kind of suggests a focus on personal growth, being efficient, successful.
Right, a real go-getter.
And then there's Sophia. She's from Madrid, but she's living in New York. She says she's a graphic designer and loves anything creative and artistic. Her hobbies are traveling and photography, especially taking pictures of nature and cityscapes.
So you immediately get this sense of someone who's visually oriented, drawn to beauty. Maybe that speaks to a cultural appreciation for art and aesthetics, which, Spain is known for.
Totally. And her love of travel and capturing different scenes, that suggests a curiosity about the world, wanting to experience different cultures.
Yeah, a real sense of exploration and wanting to document those experiences visually.
Exactly. Okay, next up we have David from Toronto. He works as a software engineer, loves anything to do with computers and programming.
Not surprising given the huge tech scene in a lot of the Western world these days.
Right. But here's the interesting part. He also plays guitar, composes music, and is a big hiker, loves the outdoors.
Oh, I like that. So it's not just all tech all the time.
Nope. He's got this artistic side, but also that appreciation for nature. Maybe that speaks to a Canadian cultural value, that love of the outdoors and wide open spaces.
Yeah, I could see that. It's like he's got this nice balance of interests, the technical, the artistic, and the natural world.
Totally. Last but not least, we have Aisha. She's from Cairo, and she is an English teacher. She says she really enjoys helping people learn.
That's lovely. It suggests a value placed on education and communication skills, which are pretty universal.
Definitely. But she also loves to read historical fiction. And get this, she enjoys cooking dishes from all different cultures.
Interesting. The historical fiction might speak to a love of storytelling and maybe a connection to cultural heritage. And the cooking, that could be a sign of curiosity about other cultures, plus, a value placed on hospitality, which is often associated with Middle Eastern cultures.
It's amazing how much you can pick up from just these simple introductions, right?
Right. You get a sense of their personalities, their passions, but also these subtle hints about their cultural backgrounds. And when you think about it, all these individuals are coming together in this English class. It's like a microcosm of a globalized world.
So true. And it makes you think, right? Like if we go back to the earlier discussion about vulgarity, imagine how different Rahul's perspective might be compared to Sophia's or David's compared to Aisha's. what might seem offensive to one could be completely unremarkable to another.
Exactly. It really underscores how subjective our judgments are, how much our backgrounds shape what we consider acceptable or not.
So, as we wrap up here, I think the big takeaway is that understanding culture isn't just about knowing the rules or the do's and don'ts.
Okay, I like that. It's deeper than that.
It's about recognizing that there are these big open discussions about values, like the one Raj and Amit were having.
Right.
But there are also these subtle ways that culture shows up in our everyday lives, in the things we choose to share about ourselves, in our interests, in how we see the world.
It's like culture is both something we talk about and something we live.
Exactly. So here's a final thought for all of you listening. Think about your own life. What experiences have shaped your ideas about what's normal, what's okay, what's maybe even a little bit shocking? Have you ever been surprised by someone else's perspective? And what did you learn from that? It's those moments of encountering difference that can really help us grow and understand the amazing diversity of human experience. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and keep exploring the fascinating world of culture.